So I'll start with my background, which Fernanda already gave you the highlights. I was a banker. I've been in finance for over 20 years. As I was saying a few minutes before we got started, cryptocurrency is largely a self-taught thing for many people. It's so new. I've been following it, not quite since 2011, but certainly since 2013. And I've done a lot of other things as well. The most important thing that I really wanted to start this presentation with and hammer home, because it's important, is that number one, I'm not giving any investment advice. So trading cryptocurrency is great. I think it's a wonderful thing that I want people to understand. And you know what? Not only am I not giving investment advice, I'm also not giving out any chocolate cake. Sorry about that. The only objective tonight is education, only education. The cryptocurrency industry is completely in its infancy. All investments are highly speculative and highly volatile. So if anyone does decide as a result of this presentation or anything else to invest in cryptocurrency, you really need to be prepared that anything you invest, you could lose 100%. And it's an entirely different Wild West world than the investment industry that you're probably used to. Regulation is brand new and is evolving, and there are ways that large players can manipulate the markets and data that don't exist in traditional finance. Because it's so complicated, there are tons of scams and lots of fraud. Actually, that is one of my major objectives, is to provide education so that people can, for themselves, weed out the difference between the scammers and the fraudsters and who are doing the real projects. And the real projects are still subject to huge volatility and huge risk, but at least they're real projects compared to the scammers whose only objective is to separate you from your wealth. And certainly anybody who's promising a guaranteed return is a scammer, and you should run away. And I'll say now, feel free to ask me questions at any point. I put my Twitter handle and my LinkedIn name up there. You're welcome to connect with me. If at any point you're thinking about something or you want to know more after tonight, please feel free to reach out. It is my passion to talk about cryptocurrency and to educate people about cryptocurrency, particularly people who know nothing about it to start with. So really, I am here as a resource, and that is all, as a resource. I'm not selling anything, and I'm not providing investment advice. So any questions about that? Okay, good. Okay, so this is the agenda for tonight. Sections B and C are pretty theoretical. They're the most dense, complex part of the presentation, and we'll start with them to get them out of the way first. And it is not necessary to fully understand the theory and some of the technical details in order to use the cryptocurrency. Just like you don't have to understand how email works in order to use email, but we'll start there at the beginning. D through G are the nuts and bolts of how you use it and what it's good for and how it works. And then I'll talk about H and I if we have time. That's kind of the current next steps of where Bitcoin has evolved and other cryptocurrencies have evolved to. We'll end with what's going on in Zug today very briefly, because here we all are in the crypto valley, and then we'll conclude with questions. But please, I want this to be a conversation. If you have questions as we go along, don't hesitate to ask me, yell them out, wave your hand, send up smoke signals, whatever you'd like. Really, it should be a conversation, and I anticipate a lot of requests for clarification. And for those of you on Zoom, just chat your questions at Fernanda, and Fernanda will relay them back to me. So before we get started, question for all of you. Who here has ever used money? Anyone ever paid with cash? Coins? Credit card? Bank transfer? Yes, okay. So who can explain to me what money is? Oh, that's a little tougher. So we'll go to the standard economic definition of money. And it helps to think about really what money is at its most fundamental level before we talk about the world's newest form of money. So let's start with money as a means of exchange. So if you think way back in history, people had the barter system. I had a cow, you had a lot of wheat, we would exchange, we'd figure out how many grains of wheat or bushels of wheat or however they weighed them were worth my cow, and we would trade. But of course, that's not very convenient. And as human civilization evolved, money developed as a way to exchange goods and services, so we weren't always reliant on the barter system and me having exactly what you wanted to trade. And as commerce continued to evolve, money also becomes used as a unit of account. So if you go into the store and you want to buy toothpaste, the toothpaste doesn't cost 10 grapefruit, or it doesn't cost a quarter of a cow. It's denominated, its value is listed in a particular currency that's money. So the second fundamental feature of money is that it has to be used to be able to detail the value or the worth of something as a unit of account. And then the third criteria for money is that it's used as a store of value. So to go back to my grapefruit analogy, if I had all my wealth in grapefruit, that wouldn't be very practical because they would rot and then my wealth would be gone. So when we're looking for something that we want to use as money, we want something that can store value for a long period of time, ideally indefinitely. And so over the course of human history and human commerce, a huge variety of things has filled these three criteria: means of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. I mean, originally primitive metal coins, and now as we get into the modern era, paper notes were a relatively recent invention of governments. And today, really all, not all, but most money is electronic numbers that are stored in a bank's ledger somewhere. So they're stored in a central bank record, and people trust those banks to keep accurate records of our store of value. So moving on from that picture, we'll next talk about how is Bitcoin born into the world in about 2008. So if you think back to what I think most of us in the room remember 2008, governments around the world are responsible for issuing coins and paper money, and those coins and paper money act as the three features of money: a unit of account, a means of exchange, and a store of value. And since about the middle of the last century, roughly, most sovereign money isn't backed by any sort of gold or other reserve value. It's backed only by the promise of the government that those bills can be redeemed. And that gives governments the ability to, quote unquote, print money out of thin air to finance their spending. The financial infrastructure at the time is highly centralized. There are big players who control vast amounts of the financial infrastructure. And each of those central intermediaries is involved in the transfer of money from one place to another, and each one of them charges a fee. And if you remember, in 2008, there was a massive global financial crisis, and the central authorities that are responsible for transferring value from one person to another really lost the trust of a huge segment of the globe because of the frauds and the scandals and the abuse of financial power that occurred at that time. And in addition to that, there's some statistics that say about 3 billion people in the globe didn't have access to the financial system anyway, whether they were living in an impoverished part of the world or even in a developed country, but for whatever reason, were unable to open an account at a bank and have access to a financial system. So this to the financial system. So this was the state of the world when something extraordinary happened. So in 2009, an anonymous author going by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto posted what's called a white paper into an online forum. And this is one of the truly weird things about Bitcoin's origin. To this day, nobody knows who Satoshi Nakamoto was. He, she, they were using an email address, and no one has ever been able to connect that email address to a real world identity. But whoever they were, this person posted, or people posted a white paper, and it explained how to use technology and cryptographic techniques and the internet fundamentally to create a digital currency that would meet those fundamental criteria of being money. This digital currency could be used as a means of exchange, as a unit of account, and as a store of value. And importantly, given everything that was going on in 2008, it would use the internet to completely eliminate all of those many central authorities who were each taking their fee, their cut of the pie, and standing in between the two parties to a transaction. So this was a libertarian vision to eliminate the middleman and put power into the hands of individual people to send money directly from me to you. And the theory was this would reduce the amount of fees that each user, each transactor was paying, because you wouldn't have so many middlemen taking their cut. And on top of that, the idea for Bitcoin is that it would have absolutely predictable monetary policy. So one of the things that many people were upset about in 2008 was the government's ability, as I mentioned, to create new money to finance the deficits that had occurred and devalue currency. This problem in the US, it's even more of a problem in other parts of the world. Bitcoin's monetary policy, as laid out in this original white paper, is completely fixed. It's hard-coded into the system that Satoshi Nakamoto described, that there would only ever be 21 million Bitcoin in existence ever, period, and that can't be changed. But most critically, people had tried to have digital currencies over the years previously, but nobody could ever stop the double spend problem. So today, if I send you money via bank transfer, my bank keeps a record, a ledger, that I've spent that money and I can't spend it again. So the central puzzle that Satoshi Nakamoto solved was, how do you have a decentralized system with no bank sitting in the middle keeping a record of transactions, but still prevent me from spending the same currency more than once? And in that white paper, he announced the solution. And so we're going to talk about exactly how he solved that problem. And just another caveat again, to echo what I said in the introduction. The next slide is probably the most complex part of the presentation. It's important because I want to explain how you can have security and how Satoshi solved the double spend problem without having a central intermediary. But it's not really necessary to completely grasp how the whole cryptography works in order to be able to use the system. So again, I'm just gonna do a little analogy here with a quiz. Who here has used email? Yes, I would imagine most hands go up. Who has purchased something online? Yeah, everyone? But why am I not surprised? We have one no in the audience. So whether you've purchased something online or not, who can talk through every step of how it works when you buy something online? Right? We don't really need to know to be able to use the online systems. And Bitcoin is a lot like that. It just is a different way of going about the same thing. Okay, so Satoshi's idea is that there would be individuals called miners who would use a computer program to solve a mathematical puzzle in return for a reward. And this puzzle was created by the code, the algorithm that Satoshi wrote. And I'll just remind you again, this is number one, the most dense, complicated part of the presentation. And number two, please interrupt me for questions, because I can already see some furrowed brows as everyone's concentrating, which is great. So each person with a computer would take Satoshi's program and they would attempt to solve a very complicated mathematical problem. And the first person to solve the problem would get a reward. Oh, by the way, I should have said this at the beginning too. I am happy to share these slides with anybody who wants them. I have a lot of links in here for other resources. And so if anybody wants them, I'll distribute them. We can distribute them to anybody who's registered. So every person who wants to be a miner, they have their computer, they put the code on it that Satoshi has created, and this signs them up to start solving mathematical puzzles. So you can think about this a little bit like a giant game of Scrabble. So Satoshi's algorithm creates games of Scrabble. So each game is a new board. And the miners who are racing against each other to solve the problem have Scrabble tiles, and they have to be the first one to put every tile down on the board to complete the board. And the first person to get the board completed wins. And when that miner wins the race, that miner is rewarded in two ways. They get new Bitcoin that are mined. They're sort of created out of thin air, and they're just electronic records of a currency. And they get all of the transaction fees that of everybody trying to send a Bitcoin transaction at that point in time. So every miner wants to be the first one to solve this problem so that they can get both the Bitcoin reward and the transaction fees. And once the miner has the solution to the problem, which is very complicated mathematically, the miner broadcasts that solution out to every other miner in the network. And the interesting thing about this problem, this mathematical problem that Satoshi created, is that it's very, very hard to solve it, but it's very easy to check that the solution is correct. So this is where you can think about a square root. Is everybody familiar with the mathematical concept of square root? So if you have 16, the square root of 16 is 4, because 4 times 4 is 16. If you have 9, the square root of 9 is 3, because 3 times 3 is 9. So if you have a huge, giant number, the only way to find the square root, there's no trick, there's no shortcut. You just have to guess at it, multiply that number by itself, and see how close you get. And then you keep trying until you get the right number. And if you have a huge, giant number, you need a computer to test, to guess, to make multiple guesses to try to get the right root of that giant number. But once you know the square root, all you have to do is multiply it by itself, and you get the answer. So the first miner to come up with the number tells everybody else. And once everybody agrees, or 51% of the network agrees, yep, that number's right, that block is now considered final. And so every miner on the network, every person with a computer who's mining Bitcoin now has a record of that completed block of transactions. And what's in that block of transactions is every exchange of Bitcoin that anybody has submitted to the network. So if I want to send Fernanda 5 Bitcoin, that's kind of like a Scrabble tile. So I'll put my request to send Fernanda 5 Bitcoin into the pile of Scrabble tiles. I will declare to the network, I want to send 5 Bitcoin. I'm willing to pay 1/10 of a Bitcoin as the fee for that. And then that will become part of what each miner uses to solve the puzzle. So that's the Scrabble tile. And when the block is completed, when the miner is able to put every tile on the board in the correct order and declares, yep, I've solved the problem, then my Bitcoin goes to Fernanda. She gets the 5 Bitcoin. The miner gets the 1/10 of the Bitcoin that was the fee, plus the Bitcoin reward. That's the Bitcoin that's created out of thin air. And my transaction of 5 Bitcoin going to Fernanda is permanently part of the Bitcoin record. But instead of that record being stored in a bank's ledger somewhere, it's stored in the computers of every single person who's mining. Because it was the first person who put the puzzle together, but they then had to share the solution with every single other miner in order for it to be considered valid. And now every independent, decentralized computer that's working on mining Bitcoin has a record of my transaction, and I can't turn around and try to spend that 5 Bitcoin somewhere else, because every single miner has a record of that transaction, because they have that Scrabble board that the miner who first solved it distributed to the network. So let me just stop there and see if there are some questions. Yes.
Strangely enough, I'm lost already. But 2 things. So at the beginning, I thought the whole point is that there are no fees. Do I misunderstand that? I thought the whole creation depends on the fact that there's no fees.
It's not that there are no fees, okay, but the idea is that if you're reducing the number of intermediaries, let's see if I can go back. So the idea would be, in the traditional system, you have what, eight financial institutions between me and Fernanda, who are each going to take their slice of the transaction. But if you go with the theory with Bitcoin is that there's nobody but the internet and the miner between me and Fernanda. And so,
sorry, could you just be, okay, yes. So my misunderstanding, it says reduced fees.
Yeah.
So there are fees for this.
There are fees.
Yeah, I thought that's not. But the second question is, so within that initial chain group, within that block of people on computers on that transaction, there are witnesses to the fact that you spent it, right?
There are what?
There are witnesses to when you're saying that you can see that you spent the five, the exact number, and you can't spend them again because everybody knows. But can it not be that you can spend it on another group that does not qualify this? But it's a closed group, right?
Yeah. So
how does another group not know that you've already spent it?
yeah, so that's a great question. So, and this is exactly where the idea of a blockchain comes in. So when that Scrabble puzzle is solved, that's a block. And that block is a record of every transaction that was submitted. And let me just finish this one. Oh yeah, sorry, thank you. Yeah, thank you. The first question, sorry, was does Bitcoin eliminate fees? And the answer is no, it doesn't eliminate them. It just reduces them because there are fewer intermediaries. The second question was, how does the whole network of people who are mining Bitcoin know that I've spent the 5 Bitcoin, that I've sent it to Fernanda, and there isn't some other group of miners somewhere else who doesn't have that information? And that's a great question because that's the essence of the blockchain. So the Scrabble puzzle is a record that Allison sent 5 Bitcoin to Fernanda. So 2 things happen in order for that transaction to settle or to be considered completely valid. Well, maybe more than 2. First, the miner has to solve the puzzle. And solving that puzzle puts my transaction into it, and that's the point of settlement at which the Bitcoin goes to Fernanda. That miner, or sorry, the Bitcoin doesn't transfer at that point. That miner then tells every other miner through a process that you can sort of think of as gossip. So every miner isn't connected to every other miner. It's sort of like how the internet works today. But every miner is connected to enough other miners that as they broadcast the solution to the puzzle, every miner passes it on to every other miner that they're connected to. So very quickly through the internet, the news that there is a solution for the current block spreads throughout the network. And as soon as 51% of people agree that the solution is correct, because remember, it's hard to solve, but it's very easy to check. So once 51% of miners agree that that's correct, that's considered final. And then the next puzzle begins. But in order to solve the next puzzle, you have to have the answer to the previous puzzle. So you can't even start solving the next puzzle unless you know the answer to the previous puzzle. And you can't have started solving the answer to the previous puzzle unless you had the answer to the previous puzzle before that. And so today, whenever anybody wants to start mining Bitcoin, the very first thing that they have to do is trace the puzzles all the way back to what's called the Genesis block, to the very first block that was created in order to start solving the problem for today's puzzle. And so that involves a huge amount of energy and some time to sync your node to your computer to the Bitcoin network. But the benefit of that is that there was a permanent record of my transfer to Fernanda. And it's not possible for somebody to start mining Bitcoin today without having gone back through the whole chain and therefore having a record of what happened to that Bitcoin.
Well, my question is, how many miners are there? And what happens when a miner resigns or steps down from his job?
That's a great question.
Or is it robots?
No, they're big businesses today. As a question to how many miners there are, remind me of, sorry, so the question was, how many miners are there today and what happens when a miner resigns? So I don't know the exact number. I have some statistics on who's mining Bitcoin today. I'll get to that in a minute. And what happens when a miner resigns? Nothing. That's the beauty of a decentralized system. If I'm a miner and I'm out of money and I don't want to do it anymore, I just unplug, basically. And life goes on as usual. As long as 51% of miners are active, there's security in the system. Because every individual miner has a complete copy of the whole chain of transactions. And so every miner today knows exactly how much Bitcoin is in every person's account. Or rather, in every account. They don't know whose account it is, but every miner has a record of how many Bitcoin are in each account. Yes.
How do you check if the solution of the problem is the right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, how do you check if the solution is the right one? So it's a bit of it's a puzzle, and it involves guessing. And the first person to think they have the solution tells everybody else, here's my solution. And it's a problem. This is the square root analogy that's very hard to find the answer of, but it's very easy to check. So if somebody asks you, what's the square root of 16? So a square root is just two numbers that are exactly the same that are multiplied by each other. If you don't, so 16, it's fairly easy to think the square root of that is 4. And if I tell you the square root of the square root of 16 is 4, it's very easy for you to say, okay, 4 times 4, 16, yes, you're right. But if the number is 10,962, you have to just try a lot of combinations until you get the one that's exactly multiplied by itself to get that huge number. But once I tell you what that number is, it's very easy to just multiply it by itself and to check to see if it's correct. So the computers are racing to be the first to get the solution, but once they get it, it's very easy for everybody else in the network to check it. Is there a question on Zoom?
Yes, there are two questions. One is, what is there stopping someone just asking Google what is the square root of the number?
That's a great question. So I don't know if do I need to repeat the Zoom question?
No.
Okay. The answer is because it's not a square root. That's a very oversimplified solution. It is a much more complicated math problem. And in fact, the computers that are mining Bitcoin today are testing literally quadrillions of solutions a second to try to get the right one.
Another question, how would Fernanda cash her Bitcoin, and where does she receive it? In a bank account, or where? And how can she use it?
Excellent question. Let's hold on that. I'm going to cover all of those in a little bit. Any other questions?
Are you coming to forking later on?
Am I coming with?
Fork. And the big one's fork.
Ah, forking. So the question was, am I going to talk about forking? No, I wasn't planning on talking about that, but I can. Let's hold that and come back to forking at the end. That's a good question. Okay. So we've talked about mining and how we get the solution, and I briefly jumped ahead to talk about what the blockchain is. So just to recap what exactly the blockchain is, historically, the banks have a ledger. They have a spreadsheet where they keep a record of everybody's accounts. And if you think about it today, most of our money is electronic numbers that are on a bank spreadsheet somewhere, and we trust that they're going to keep that number accurate. And a lot of the intermediaries in the financial system are necessary because the banks are exchanging information and updating their ledgers as we're all having transactions with each other. And banks spend an awful lot of time and energy checking their records to ensure that everybody's records at the end of the day are accurate and agree with each other, and that transactions are accurately recorded. So Bitcoin, since it doesn't have a centralized intermediary, there's no CEO of Bitcoin, there's no Bitcoin warehouse, it needs a similar system to record every transaction. And so the blockchain, as I was mentioning earlier, is that ledger. So you can think of the blockchain as like a giant Excel spreadsheet that's stored on the computer of every single miner. And so every time one of these puzzles is solved, the effect of that is that every miner is just updating their spreadsheet to change the values in everybody's accounts to reflect the transactions that have just happened. And before somebody asks me, well, how come somebody can't just hack into their computer and change the Excel spreadsheet? it's the Excel spreadsheet is an oversimplification. It's not really an Excel spreadsheet. It's math, computer science, and cryptography that keeps those transactions very safe and permanently embedded in that spreadsheet. But it's a simplification to think of the blockchain as a linked series of spreadsheets on everybody's computer, and each transaction, each batch of transactions that's processed by a miner updates those spreadsheets so that everybody's account balances are updated to reflect their transactions. So going back to Satoshi, he, she, they published these ideas in a I think it's 16-page white paper, giving the practicalities of how to create this system. And people then took those ideas, his cryptographic plan, and they put them into code, and they created programs on their own computers that would start running these algorithms and would start mining Bitcoin. And slowly, globally, miners in all parts of the world started on their ordinary PCs mining Bitcoin and sharing the solutions with one another and transferring the Bitcoin back and forth. And so the Genesis block, the very first block of Bitcoin, was created in January of 2009. And by May 22nd, 2010, it's a famous day in Bitcoin history, there was the first real transaction with Bitcoin. So a developer in Florida, Laszlo, decided that he was hungry. He posted a message into an online forum saying, I'll give 10,000 Bitcoins if somebody will give me 2 Papa John's pizzas. So somebody read that message on the forum who was in the UK. He called up Papa John's. He had them deliver 2 pizzas to Laszlo's house in Florida. And in return, Laszlo sent him 10,000 Bitcoins. So I made my big speech about volatility and speculation. On May 22nd, 2010, those 10,000 Bitcoins were worth $41. So not a bad deal for 2 pizzas. Anybody know what those 10,000 Bitcoins would be worth today? $130 million. Most expensive pizza purchase ever. So let's talk about what's happened to Bitcoin today. So there are all kinds of tools that track the price and the performance of the Bitcoin currency. So if you look at this graph, it's from more or less inception when Bitcoin was worth fractions of a penny on the dollar, up to that big green spike at around November of 2017. I don't know if anyone remembers, that's when Bitcoin really became mainstream and people started buying it. It went up to close to $20,000. And then of course, where we are today. The funny thing I will tell you, I started on this presentation a couple weeks ago. I've been updating it. Every time I go back to it, I have to update these numbers because the price of Bitcoin changes so much. But as of the last time I looked, it was around $13,000 for 1 Bitcoin today, roughly. Who knows, maybe by now it's 12,000, but in that ballpark. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to point out with this chart, so the green line is the price. The gray bars are the volume. And if you look at where we are in the gray bars, it's 20, 30, 40 billion dollars of Bitcoin that's being traded per day, every day in that chart. And actually, the interesting thing for me, the volumes are more now than they were even back in 2017 when we had the beginning of the mass boom of Bitcoin purchasing. So the question was, how many miners are there today? So I don't know exactly how many miners there are, but a company put together, or an organization, actually, I don't think they're a company, a heat map of where mining is taking place in the world today. So they were able to look at the computing power and equate it to energy usage, because these computers that are processing these huge numbers of transactions every second are chewing up an enormous amount of energy. So this organization put together a heat map of where is that energy being consumed, and you can see that on the map. It's pretty global. The bigger the circle, the more energy that's being consumed, but it's actually a little bit misleading because the vast majority of Bitcoin mining that's happening today is in China. So in some recent statistics, these aren't real time, but recent enough, China had 65% of the electricity usage for Bitcoin mining in the world. And miners have grouped together in pools where they share computing power and share the rewards. And those are the top 5 mining pools in the world. What's that? No. Oh, although I forgot to say, speaking of Switzerland, the amount of energy that's being consumed per year today to mine Bitcoin is equivalent to the amount of energy that all of Switzerland consumes. So Bitcoin mining is not a low energy endeavor today. It requires a huge amount of energy. So one of the things that people look for who are mining Bitcoin is cheap sources of electricity. And so I think that's why Kazakhstan and Malaysia show up, is because theirs have access to cheaper energy. Yes.
What about the topic of being anonymous when it all started, like the deep dark web and Bitcoins were being used to pay things? And China, for example, is a state that wants to know what their people do. So if you can track that 65% are doing it there, I mean, what's with the government, and they're not supposed to be wealthier than their neighbor, or this whole topic of communism and all these things. So I'm a little bit, maybe you can just elaborate on this.
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me come back to that, because Bitcoin is not an anonymous network. The question was
Originally, I mean, it was about, I read stories 8 years ago, 6 years ago, about it being used for, unidentified people.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so the question is, isn't Bitcoin anonymous? Number one, how do we know? How do we come up with these statistics? And number two, in places like China, where the government wants to know what people are doing, how does that square with having an anonymous currency solution? And the answer is, it's not exactly anonymous. This is one of the interesting contradictions of Bitcoin, but I'm going to talk about how people get Bitcoin accounts. And I think that in just a second, I think that's the best place for me to answer that very good question. But the last thing I was going to say, to the point about China, those mining pools, FT Pool, Poolin, Ant Pool, and Huobi, those are all in China. And I actually couldn't find good information about where BTC.com, the third pool, is located, but there are some suspicions that it's actually owned by one of the others, and therefore is also Chinese. So the vast majority of Bitcoin mining that's happening today is happening in China. And yes, there's a lot of interesting discussion and tension between a pseudonymous currency and Bitcoin, and I'll come back to touch on that in just a second. Because the next question is, okay, that's interesting, but how do I get Bitcoin? How does an ordinary person, where do all these people who are these billions of dollars of Bitcoin, how are they getting it? And the answer is, there are 3 basic ways. So if you remember the pizza transaction, the simplest way, and what Satoshi and the libertarian community initially envisioned, is purely peer-to-peer. I have something you want, you have Bitcoin, you give me, we meet in person, you give me Bitcoin, I give you drugs, unfortunately, or maybe cash, or maybe a pizza. And so it's a pure peer-to-peer exchange. The second way to get it is what we were just talking about, to mine it. Because anyone who's mining Bitcoin gets Bitcoin from 2 sources, the reward that the network creates and the transaction fees that everybody pays for their transaction to go. But the third way, and by far the most popular way that the average person gets Bitcoin, is they purchase it from an exchange. So like all other uses of the internet, people figured out that they could create a marketplace for people who wanted to buy and sell Bitcoin. So I don't need to meet you and give you cash in exchange for your Bitcoin. We can go online to a marketplace that is connecting buyers and sellers all over the world. And so there began to be businesses that grew up that are exchanges, a lot like stock market exchanges, where you go and you can exchange your dollars or your renminbi or your Swiss franc, I guess we are in Switzerland after all, for Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies. And so today there are, oh gosh, dozens, maybe even hundreds of exchanges that exist. And I just pulled up the top 5 biggest, but you can see their volume in the last 24 hours. So Binance did almost $7 billion of Bitcoin trades in the last 24 hours. And actually, I checked this earlier today too. This is already outdated. Today, they did something like 11 billion. There's been a lot of activity in the crypto markets today. And by the way, I'm just going to say it again, with everything that I talk about, there are no endorsements here. I'm not endorsing any of these exchanges. But so those are the 3 ways that people today can get Bitcoin. You can get it directly from another person, you can mine it, or you can go to an exchange and you can buy it. So this starts to answer your question. How do you buy it? What does that look like? And to buy Bitcoin, you need a wallet. So what's a wallet? So if you remember my spreadsheet analogy, the Bitcoin blockchain is just a record on the computers of all of the different miners of every single transaction that's ever happened in the Bitcoin history. And therefore it's a record of the number of Bitcoins that is in everybody's account. And by the way, just as an aside, just to complicate things a little bit more, you don't necessarily have to be a miner to have a complete copy of the record. There are other people who, for whatever reason, don't want to actually mine, but so there are even more people who have full copies of the complete Bitcoin blockchain on their servers or their computers. And so all of these different people and companies and entities all over the world have records of all of the transactions and all of the balances in everybody's account. And you can think of this as kind of like a distributed spreadsheet that everybody has access to and everybody has the same information. So a wallet then is simply one cell in the spreadsheet that corresponds to your account. So you can think of it sort of like a bank account or even like a safety deposit box. And what's in that box is what belongs to you. And your box, your account, has 2 features associated with it. It has a public address. So if you could think about going into a bank, you can tell everybody which safety deposit box is yours. I'm box, A5 in this wall of safety deposit boxes. And that public address is a really long number. That string of letters and numbers is actually just a scientific mathematic way of representing a super big number. And that is your public address. That's your safety deposit box, your account on the Bitcoin blockchain. That's your public address. But through cryptography, this is one of the innovations that Satoshi came up with. Cryptographically, every public address is permanently tied to a private key. And that's that other string of letters and numbers. And so the public address is what you tell the world. It's where to find your safety deposit box that has your Bitcoin inside it. But your private key is your key. It's what you use to get inside your box. And in theory, you shouldn't share that with anybody. So to start to answer the question about anonymity and pseudonymity, those public addresses are visible to anybody. So anybody can look at the Bitcoin blockchain, because remember, it's replicated all over the world on tons of miners and other people's computers. And they can see exactly what's inside 3FZBG, whatever.
How many units of Bitcoin is in there?
Yes, anybody can see that. But what is not visible to anybody at least theoretically from the beginning, is who owns that public address. And the most interesting example of this tension between pseudonymity is that a lot of people have done research into the forensic research into the Bitcoin blockchain to try to figure out which accounts belong to Satoshi Nakamoto. Because remember, nobody's been able to figure out who she, he, they is, who published this white paper, just an email address. But people know which accounts belong to Satoshi. And they can see that in today's prices, there's $9 billion worth of Bitcoin in Satoshi's accounts. But nobody has been able to tie that public address to the real life identity of a person. And so that's one of the reasons that nobody knows who Satoshi is today. Yes?
So, two questions. So to me, as a layperson, purchasing or exchanging sounds a lot simpler than mining.
Yes.
I'm wondering, A, why doesn't anybody bother to mine? And B, based on that system, where is there the control that I don't double spend my amount? Because nobody knows it's mine.
Yeah. So two questions. One is, mining seems like a lot of work. Why would anybody bother to mine? And the second is, where is the control to ensure that I don't double spend what's in that account? So let me answer the second one first. The control on the double spend. So the control on the double spend, I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit. When I want to send, we'll go back to my example to send Fernanda her 5 Bitcoin. I have, let's say I only have 5 Bitcoin in my account at 3FZBG, whatever. In order to send that 5 Bitcoin, I need to use my private key. Actually, to make the math easier, let's say I have 5.1 Bitcoin. So I sign a message using my private key, which only I have access to, and I put it out to the network of miners saying, please move 5 Bitcoin from my account to Fernanda's account. I'm willing to pay 1/10 of a Bitcoin for that. And so that becomes a tile in the Scrabble puzzle. And the miner then picks up that tile and they use it to try to solve the Scrabble puzzle, to put words, you know, actual words onto the board, just like you do. Is Scrabble a thing in Switzerland, actually? Am I using a bad analogy? Does everybody know what Scrabble is? Okay. Boy, that would have been an unfortunate realization at this point in the presentation. Yeah, so my transaction, my 5 Bitcoin to Fernanda is a Scrabble tile with a value of 1/10 of a Bitcoin. So all of the miners are racing to put tiles down on the board in the form of actual words, no cheating, and to be the first one to get all of the tiles onto the board. And when they do that, and then they announce the solution to the network, 51% of people agree that, yep, I as a miner found the correct solution. That transaction, that block of transactions, including my 5 Bitcoin going to Fernanda, becomes a permanent record of the chain, in the chain. So a day later, if I try to use my private key to spend that 5 Bitcoin again, when I try to put that block into the Scrabble game, it's like the tile won't work, because any miner would know that that 5 Bitcoin had already been spent, because they would have had to have the record from the previous game that showed that I already spent it.
Yeah, well, initially I thought they're all separate, like mining is one thing and purchasing is one thing, but it is all connected.
It is all connected, because every transaction is recorded on the blockchain. Every transaction is a Scrabble tile that gets used to solve the puzzle and becomes a permanent part of the block.
It's not like the miners do their thing and the purchasers do their thing.
It's all intricately connected. Yep. And every transaction is permanently recorded on the blockchain. So forget anonymity. Not only can anybody see what's in any account at any given time. They can see what's ever has been in the account. And they can see where a particular Bitcoin has been in its whole life because everything is public on the Bitcoin blockchain. And so I go back to that pizza transaction, that those 10,000 Bitcoin that were used to buy a pizza back in 2010. People who are really into Bitcoin have had fun tracing those Bitcoin to see who owns them today. And I mean, depending on how much work you want to do, you could figure out exactly where all of those 10,000 Bitcoin are sitting today, because the network is completely public, but public only to the degree where that address is public. And then the question is, what do you do to connect a real person to that public address? If all you have is an email, which is all you needed in the early days, which is all Satoshi used, if you can't figure out who owns that email address, that person will remain completely mysterious. Yes, question?
How do you get a wallet? What if, like, I don't have a wallet and you want to give me 5 Bitcoin?
Good question. So how do you get a wallet? There are 2 basic ways that an average person would do it. So the easiest way, and what most people do when they first buy their Bitcoin, is they go to an exchange. So I mentioned an exchange is just an online marketplace that matches buyers and sellers. So you can go, I just very randomly picked Kraken. This is not an endorsement for Kraken, but if you go to their website, the people at Kraken have created a really nice user interface, a website. You will go and create a Kraken account, just like you would create a UBS account. And then Kraken will create a nice way for you to make an account, a Bitcoin wallet. And that's one way. Now, this is the important thing about the private key and the public key. The private key and the public address. If you go to an exchange and you create an account with an exchange, the exchange will help you to own and create a wallet. But the exchange then becomes the custodian of your private key. So when you're using an exchange to hold your wallet, to hold your Bitcoin, you don't have access to the private key. So if the exchange gets hacked, or the exchange isn't keeping good track of whose Bitcoin is where because they don't have good records, then you can lose your Bitcoin. And so especially early on, a lot of the big stories that hit the news about big Bitcoin hacks and thefts, from a cryptographic perspective, it's important to differentiate. The Bitcoin blockchain itself has never been compromised. No one has ever been able to get around the double spend protection and spend the same Bitcoin twice or take Bitcoin in an unauthorized way out of someone's wallet. But lots of people lost money because they were storing their Bitcoin on exchanges and they didn't have control of their own private keys. And in fact, the most famous example, I can't remember, well, the most famous example is an exchange called Mt. Gox, which was a little bit like 3 guys in a basement who suddenly, because Bitcoin became popular, became custodians of hundreds of millions of dollars, and they just didn't have the right procedures in place to manage that kind of volume, and they lost a lot of money. But another famous example, and I can't think of the name of the exchange, was the guy who was holding hundreds of millions of dollars of cryptocurrency for his clients, and then he died. There's some suspicion that maybe he didn't really die, but after he disappeared, it was discovered that he was the only one with the private key. No one else in the company had the private keys. And so that cryptocurrency is gone. If you don't have the private key, there is absolutely no way to get it back. It's gone. Well, yeah, or he's dead, or who knows what happened to him. Then it's gone. Yeah. And there are other stories of people who kept their private key on their laptop, and when Bitcoin was worth pennies on the dollar, they threw their laptop out. And now they're literally huge projects of digging through the dumpsters and landfills to try to get that computer back so that they can recover the private key. Yes?
In this scenario, create your account, would it get open identity theft? Like, I would think you have to put their name, address, their document, their ID.
Yeah,
Things
yeah.
like this, so Kraken, I guess you're saying it's a reputable company, but
I'm not saying that. No endorsement.
I don't know, but, you know, the people behind it who have to set this up.
Yeah, so that you,
Obviously have your passport or have your
Yeah.
address and your
Yeah.
number, you know, identity.
yeah, so yes, so you come from the banking industry, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of
But
the,
my kids also want to buy Bitcoin, so, you
Yeah.
know, as a teenager.
yeah, so yes, so that was, this is a really interesting tension in the cryptocurrency industry right now. So these exchanges are starting to look an awful lot like financial institutions. And in fact, one of the reasons why I picked Kraken is because it very recently was the first financial institution to successfully get a US banking license. So Kraken is now registered as a bank in the state of Wyoming in the US. So as any financial institution would, when you sign up for an account with Kraken, you have to do all of the know your customer procedures and all of, and the Kraken has to have all of the anti-money laundering procedures in place that any other bank would. So yes, you're going to have to verify your identity, usually using a passport. And these exchanges have all kinds of procedures for verifying people's identity. I mean, they'll have you hold up a picture of a utility bill that shows your address and take a selfie of it and compare that with your passport. And so there's a huge industry around identity verification. And so yes, from an identity perspective, if an exchange has your real life identity and your Bitcoin address, they can absolutely connect the two. And then you can see every transaction that that person has done. And yes, if your exchange gets hacked, then there's an awful lot of information that's out there about you in the real world. And before I answer your question, I'll just say on the flip side, so Bitcoin really has a very nasty association with crime and with drugs, and it's true. A lot of people used it to buy drugs early on because it was anonymous. But on the other side, I don't know if anybody heard, there was a big Twitter hack recently where actually turned out to be some teenager was able to break into Twitter and hacked into the accounts of a lot of really important people. Like I think Barack Obama's account was hacked. And he then was asking a Bitcoin ransom, which people paid him, and he got away with it. He was able to bypass all of Twitter security, but then he went to use an exchange to change the Bitcoin into whatever currency. And because then he gave his real name, and because people were able to trace the Bitcoin ransom to him, he got caught. And yes, so you were asking the question earlier on about China and surveillance. And so one of the things that's actually terrifying to people who are interested in privacy, and particularly those early adopters who saw Bitcoin as a force for removing the central authority and central oversight and supervision from the financial system and bringing financial inclusion to people, if you're able to link somebody's identity to their Bitcoin address, you suddenly have an incredibly powerful surveillance tool. And so there's a big movement in Bitcoin, or I should say in cryptocurrency, to keep privacy protections in place. And one of the things that many people are really worried about, there's a big movement towards central bank digital currencies. So taking the blockchain concepts of Bitcoin, but having the currency be issued by the central bank. And China is a big one that's looking into that. And that would give the Chinese government incredible power if all Chinese citizens were using a blockchain-based currency to surveil their population, or any government. And so it's one of the ironies that what really started as a libertarian get government out of money experiment has ended up creating the possibility for exactly the opposite. But there are a lot of people who are working hard to take the best parts of the technology and keep the privacy and the freedom and the independence features of it, but move towards mass adoption. But those are some of the problems that are being worked on today. And how do you connect Bitcoin or cryptocurrency to the legacy financial system and deal with AML and KYC and anti-terrorist financing and all of the protections that we have, while still enabling people to use the cryptocurrency is one of the foremost challenges of the industry today. But there are lots of smart minds who are working hard on solving those challenges. So that is my disclaimer about exchanges. So if you don't want to use an exchange, there is another alternative, very popular alternative. So there are other companies that have created what are called non-hosted wallets. So this is still a program that somebody else has built, but you can download their app or their software, and it allows you to easily create your own wallet, but store your private key yourself. And this is the preferred method for a lot of people who don't want to trust an exchange with their keys, and there are good exchanges, there are terrible exchanges. So if you're going to buy cryptocurrency and store it on an exchange, you certainly should do your research on the exchange as well as the cryptocurrency. But if you don't want to do that, then you can use a wallet where the wallet walks you through the steps of creating a private key, but only you know what the private key is. And so there are apps. This one is Mycelium, where you're responsible for creating your private key. But the risk there is that you have to store that private key carefully. If you keep your private key on a laptop that's connected to the internet, and somebody knows that you're holding a lot of cryptocurrency, they can hack your laptop and get your private key. So most people don't keep their private key on their laptop. They write it down somewhere, but then you don't want to lose that piece of paper. So it's interesting. Cryptocurrency gives every person the opportunity to be their own bank. But it turns out that banks actually provide a lot of services for us that maybe most people don't want to have themselves. So there are options. All right, so sending and receiving, I actually covered a lot of this already when I was talking about an answer to the question that when you're moving value, you use your private key and you know somebody else's public key, and then you use your private key to move some of the Bitcoin out of your account and into somebody else's account. And either the exchange or the wallet software, the wallet app that you're using, all of these have really nice interfaces that make it incredibly easy. You just have to get somebody else's public address and put it into your wallet. And with the punch of a button and the entering of your private key, you can send the Bitcoin. And because your Bitcoin is stored independently on the blockchain, which is housed by all of these different computers all over the world, your wallet app isn't where your Bitcoin is held. It's just the vehicle that helped you create your address and your public key, your private key. So you could decide, I don't like the software. I'm going to take my private key and I'm going to go use some other means of moving my Bitcoin. The Bitcoin isn't stored in the wallet. The wallet in the software. It's just the means of setting up your wallet that you control as long as you have the private keys. So I'm going to move on from Bitcoin, unless there are any questions about that before I take a jump into where we've gone into the future. Yes.
So now people are buying Bitcoins because of an investment in appreciation to make money, the way I see it. But originally, it was to pay somebody something without the banks being involved, and maybe not even know that I'm buying the drugs.
Yes. Yes.
But now it's like I can buy a house, I can pay for food with Bitcoin, but I don't really care if my identity. Not that I don't care, but it's more mainstream transfer payment, and it's something like an investment. Instead of buying a stock or a bond, you buy it to make money, or real estate.
Yeah. So that's a great point. So when Satoshi so the question was, or the point was, people originally conceived Bitcoin as being a currency, as a means of exchange. But today, people are really buying it not to use it, but as a store of value. That instead of buying a stock or a bond, you can buy Bitcoin because it's going to appreciate, in theory. Again, with the disclosure or the disclaimer, it will change in value, that I can guarantee, but it could go up. It also could go down. But the interesting thing is the vast majority of people, I wish I had this statistic, but it's something like 90–95% of people who are buying Bitcoin, usually on an exchange, are doing it for speculative purposes. They're buying it because they believe it's going to go up in price and they can sell it later for a profit. That was not the original idea. The original idea was that it would be used as a means of exchange, that I would buy pizzas with my Bitcoin.
You said there's 21 million. How many Bitcoins? That's a limited number, right?
Yes, 21 million.
And how many has already been issued?
Oh,
At the 10% to 30%?
no, because I can tell you. So the question was, how many Bitcoin are there and how many have already been issued? There will only ever be 21 million. So let me talk about how they get issued. So the miner who first solves the puzzle gets a reward of newly created, newly minted Bitcoin. And the way that Satoshi set up the algorithm, the amount that's issued as a reward slowly decreases until the 21 million have been issued. So in the early days, I think it was you got 25 Bitcoin every time you solved the puzzle. And then 4 years later, that was roughly cut in half to 12.5. And then 4 years later, which the Bitcoin halving just happened a few months ago. Now today miners get 6.25 Bitcoin every time they solve the puzzle. And it'll halve again. And I think it's about 2080. All 21 million will be issued. And then the only reward to miners is the transaction fees. And the idea is that by that point, Bitcoin will have appreciated enough and there will be enough transaction fees that the incentive of transaction fees will be enough for the miners to keep mining even once all of the Bitcoin have been issued. So as to how many Bitcoin have been issued today, I can get that for you. Maybe I lost my, you know what? You know, I realized I didn't answer a question about why you would ever mine, because it seems so much easier to just buy it. I can't see my screen, can you? Oh. Oh, you do?
Well, I asked Google and it says 18,525,681.
I was going to show you the liquidity supply curve. There are all these great tools that people are creating. And Masari is one of the biggest. Oh. And you can look at Bitcoin's liquidity curve. There we go. So here are the mining rewards. So what did you say, Fernanda?
I mean, it's maybe here it's 18.5 million.
Yeah, so it's probably slightly behind. So there have been about 21 million Bitcoin issued today. And because the amount that's issued as a reward for each currency, for each transaction lessens, the curve is leveling off until all 21 have been issued.
We're in 2020. 18 is right. You're in 2025.
Oh, thank you.
We'll get there.
Yes, right. Yes, there we go. I'm still not in the present. Thank you. So-
That happens every 2 years or,
What's that?
but when they start, they call it forking and they forking, is that what they call it?
Yeah, you really want to know about forking, don't you?
I'm surprised goes on, doesn't it?
No, so forking, so two concepts are being confused here. The Bitcoin reward is cut in half on a regular schedule, and it's about every 4 years. So that is, people call it the halving. And we had the last halving a few months ago when the reward went from 12.5 to 6.25. So forking, Bitcoin is a completely open source project. So the code is completely public and the blockchain is completely public. So one of the problems, the issues that a completely decentralized system faces is who makes decisions. And so a few years ago, there was a big debate around a feature of the code between miners and probably big investors. So big holders of Bitcoin and big miners. And they just couldn't come to an agreement. And so if you think of the Bitcoin blockchain as a chain of transactions, when the two groups couldn't agree, they just decided to split the chain. And so each of them had the same copy of a chain up to a point. And then group A used their code and went this way, and group B used their code and went that way. And so anybody who was holding Bitcoin at the point of the fork also got the second currency. So it's like a copy paste of the code. And so anybody holding Bitcoin at the fork also got what came to be called Bitcoin Cash, except that they had a different idea about how they wanted the code to work. And so then now there are two cryptocurrencies where there used to be one. And so there are two different blockchains that have the same history at a certain point. Sort of like a stock share splitting, except that it's not the same company anymore. It's two different companies.
But you also have different kind of Ethereum and all different kind of.
Yes, that I'm coming to. And to the question of why would you mine? And so just to back up a little bit and talk about what mining is like today. So early on, the idea was you just use your ordinary laptop. But the more chances, the more times you try to solve the puzzle, the quicker you can make attempts, the more likely it is that you'll be the first one to get it. So it's been a race to have faster and faster computers to solve the puzzles. And so somebody figured out that you could use a specialized chip, not a general all-purpose chip for a computer, but you could use a very specialized chip and you could solve the puzzle faster. And so then the people who could buy those chips had faster miners, and they were winning more of the battles, more of the races, until other people started buying those same equipment. And so it became an arms race of computer hardware and software until today. If you want to start mining, you need, no exaggeration, hundreds of millions of dollars. And so the companies backing a lot of these miners are private equity firms who have hundreds of millions of dollars to invest in the servers and the electricity and the maintenance that's required to run these miners. But a block is created about every 10 minutes. So about every 10 minutes, you get the block reward, which is 6.25 Bitcoin plus the transaction fees. So right now, 6.25 Bitcoin is like, what is that? Almost $70,000. So they're making $70,000 every 10 minutes when they are the first one to solve the puzzle. So it's that kind of return on investment that's driven people into mining.
So we all try to solve the same puzzle, right? Everybody in this room.
Right, if we're all miners.
We all try to get the same result.
Right,
And I'm the first one that does it.
right.
And then I inform them.
Then you
The
what?
minute I have it, I tell them.
Yes,
What do I get that's different to them?
you get the reward because you were the first.
And what do they get?
Nothing,
Nothing at all.
nothing. But they need the answer in order to be able to compete for the next reward.
Exactly. So only I get the reward and they get nothing.
They
but
get-
the information.
Yes,
So, but then in essence, they could be doing that all their lives without ever getting anything. Because they might never get it.
that's right. And that's why it's been an arms race to be
Exactly.
the fastest and to have the most up-to-date software. And
So at this point in time, if I tomorrow decide to become a micro, at least you do that. There's no point in doing it.
I wouldn't recommend it, no.
Exactly. But the exchange is not the exchange, the exact structure. Why is it Portugal invented it to avoid that type of middleman?
Yes, exactly.
So that's a conundrum.
Yes, that is a conundrum. And there are people who are trying to solve that. So the next question was, what about Ethereum? Aren't there other cryptocurrencies? And the answer is yes, Bitcoin was only the first. And Bitcoin could only transfer value. So just, money or funds, value from one person to another. So in 2013, a genius, 19-year-old kid by the name of Vitalik Buterin conceived something called Ethereum. And so he combined the blockchain idea with the idea of having a complete programming language so that you could program anything you wanted to into a blockchain. So Bitcoin's blockchain is kind of dumb in the fact that the only thing really it can do is transfer value. But what Ethereum envisioned is that it would be a platform, and using a language that the Ethereum co-founders created called Solidity, you could program any kind of contract you wanted using something called a smart contract. So the easiest analogy here is if you think about the iPhone, and the reason we all love our iPhones is because iPhone became a platform that everybody builds apps on top of. So what Ethereum did was create the same kind of platform, but instead of having apps built on top of it, these are decentralized apps. So rather than having Apple controlling everything, just like Bitcoin, no one controls Ethereum. There's an Ethereum blockchain, there are Ethereum miners, everybody has a record of Ethereum transactions, but now instead of just moving money, there are all kinds of different computer programs that are doing all sorts of applications that are living on the Ethereum blockchain. So this is what's known as Generation 2. And since it's getting late in the evening, and I kind of anticipated that we were not going to need to go into the weeds of Ethereum at this point, my recommendation is, if you want to learn more about Ethereum, The Infinite Machine is an excellent book for understanding the second generation of cryptocurrencies. Camilla Russo is a journalist. She's not a technologist, and it reads like a novel, but it's a true story. She interviewed all the people who were there, and it wasn't that long ago. It was only 2013. And Ethereum, this is perhaps the most critical point of the talk, is where the birth of the crypto valley occurred, because the people who were launching Ethereum, for a whole variety of reasons, ended up here in our very own Zug. So Ethereum was in some ways born here. And in The Infinite Machine, she talks about the time that the early co-founders spent in a house somewhere in Zug launching Ethereum. And from there, the crypto valley developed. So that is the second generation. So let's talk about the third generation. So you were asked, there were questions about, well, is that use of energy a good thing? No, it's not. What about the centralization of mining pools? Was that the original idea? No, it's not. There are other problems with Bitcoin and with Ethereum too around scalability. So Bitcoin at its max can only process 7 transactions per second because of that vast amount of mathematical work that has to be done, which sounds like a lot until you understand that Visa does 1,700 transactions per second. So 7 compared to 1,700, the Bitcoin blockchain could never handle the volume of transactions that Visa does. Geographical limitations, it was envisioned as something that people could use anywhere, but in fact, you have to be near cheap electricity if you want to mine Bitcoin. Because of the 7 transactions per second, the network can get congested. There are issues around final settlement that I won't go into too much detail here. And then because the network gets congested, there can be higher transaction costs. Oh, I forgot to mention this. One of the things about transaction fees, going back to me sending Fernanda 5 Bitcoin, it's up to me to decide how much I want to pay for that transaction. So I could say 0, but if I say that the transaction's going, actually, I don't know if I can technically say 0, but I could say some tiny amount. But if I say some tiny amount, what do you think the odds are that a miner is going to want to use my transaction to solve their puzzle? Not very good, because they're making money.
But then if you keep it low, and I don't want to use it, then I'm back to my question of control. Because you're still making the transaction.
No.
It gets recorded regardless.
The money does not move. If a miner doesn't pick up my transaction, it doesn't get to Fernanda.
Sorry. I thought you could always make it.
No.
Okay, so you need to be attractive.
Yeah, exactly. So I get to decide, and I can pay more if I want to ensure that it's going to go faster. But because it's a market economy, basically there's a price that's sorted out that people know on average, if I want my transaction to go at a reasonable speed, this is the price that people are paying, and it gets picked up by the miners. But those transactions, as the networks have gotten clogged, have gotten higher. And then you were asking about forking. So when there are issues around code, so one of the issues is people have said, well, shouldn't we change the Bitcoin code to allow more transactions per second? But then that has repercussions. So in a decentralized system, who decides that? And in a decentralized system where there's no company that's responsible for the code and no one's making money controlling the Bitcoin code, it's completely open. How do you decide how do the people who are developers get paid? It's a really interesting question. And so there are like ad hoc things that happen with Bitcoin and Ethereum, but there's a whole new 3rd generation of cryptocurrencies that were created to have solutions for exactly those problems. And as a side, well, yeah. So proof of stake solutions, instead of mining, it's more like a democracy where you're convincing people to give their stake to you. And the stake pools are more decentralized, and they have scalability solutions and geographical limitations and faster transaction costs in theory, and they have solutions for community governance and treasury systems to fund things while keeping everything decentralized. But if we didn't have the time, and I didn't think there was the capacity to talk about Ethereum, we certainly cannot get into proof of stake projects right now. But the proof of stake projects have all kinds of applications for voting, for property registration, for tokenization of anything around identity and data, and how you keep privacy even in this pseudonymous environment, and for decentralized finance and for supply chain. But again, I mean, we could spend hours and hours and hours and we would barely scratch the surface. But what I would refer you to is Cardano, which is a prominent proof of stake project. And the creator of Cardano is particularly articulate in terms of explaining for a non-technical audience how these things work, Charles Hoskinson. And this video, it's 45 minutes long, and he gives an excellent overview of the problems and the 3rd generation proof of stake solutions. So where are we today? So people calculate, I was looking at this a little earlier, people calculate the market cap of a currency by looking at all of the coins and multiplying it by its current price in dollars. So Bitcoin's reported market cap as of shortly before I started this presentation, almost $250 billion. Ethereum's next at 45 billion. And then on down. Cardano is number 10 on the list today. It's at 3.3. And the other proof of stake project I mentioned, Polkadot, is up there too at 4 billion. None of these are endorsements. These are just the top 10 as of today coins by market cap. And the total market cap, there are over 7,500 different cryptocurrencies in existence. And the total market cap is over $300 billion. But one of the interesting things is, look at Bitcoin compared to the total market cap. So Bitcoin is still hugely dominant in terms of all other cryptocurrencies.
When you see the price of Bitcoin is about 13,000, but then does it make sense to buy something like Polkadot or something which is cheaper?
Well, it's just all about how you divide it. So actually Polkadot, when it first launched, it was at 4,760 equivalent, but the project thought that number was off-putting, and so it's all just numbers in a computer, so they just redenominated it. And everybody who had one Polkadot, one dot is the token, suddenly had 1,000. And then the price went from 4,760 to 476. So all of these coins, because they're just virtual, can be divided, not infinitely because the code has to specify how many decimal places you can go to, but every Bitcoin is divided into, I don't know, it's like 1 million Satoshi or something like that. Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can look at the total price per coin as an indication of the value. Yeah.
So what is the youngest currency of those 10? The youngest?
I think, I'm not positive, but I think it's number 7, which is the Binance coin, was the most recent. Oh no, actually, I think it's Polkadot. I guess it depends what you mean by youngest.
Like the newest, like which came on the market.
Yeah, so I think DOT is the most recent to be publicly traded. The DOT project has been around for a while, but it was only recently listed on major exchanges. Before that, you couldn't buy it. And Binance coin, BNB number 7, is a token that's associated with the Binance exchange, is the biggest exchange in the world. So now they have their own token. I think their token release was fairly recent. But yeah, DOT just started trading 2 months ago, maybe, publicly. But the project has been around. They've been working on it for 4 years. Yeah. And again, it's not an endorsement for any of these projects. But while I have this screen up, I'm about to talk about Zug. So the Ethereum project was born here. The Ethereum Foundation is still here today. The Polkadot project has their foundation headquartered 5 minutes from here. And the Cardano Foundation is also headquartered in Zug. So, what's that?
Do you know the people behind it?
I do. Full disclosure, and again, not an endorsement for the project, but my husband works at the Polkadot Foundation, which is called the Web3 Foundation. And I know a lot of people at the Cardano Foundation also. So here we are in the Crypto Valley. So why is Zug the Crypto Valley? There are the top 50 crypto companies in Zug are valued at $37.4 billion in total. There are over 900 crypto firms in Zug. There are almost 5,000 people in blockchain companies in Zug. There are 6 unicorn projects. So a unicorn is a project that's valued at over $1 billion, 6 of them in Zug. So Ethereum, Cardano, Tezos, Polkadot, and then two others. Libra, which you may have heard of, has a presence here, and a company called Definity, which is super secretive. And there are two, actually now there are two cryptocurrency banks. So there are two banks. I mentioned Kraken got a banking license in the US. Two banks here in Zug that have banking licenses. Seba is literally around the corner here. It's a cryptocurrency bank with a FINMA license. And Signum is actually closer to Zurich, but it also has a banking license. And there's, so all of the different aspects, there are exchanges, there are custodians, there are wealth managers, those websites I was pulling up, there are analysts, there are people who make wallets, there are researchers, there are payment processors, there are people who are helping merchants accept cryptocurrency. Oh, and that's another thing I was going to say. So originally, Bitcoin was supposed to be used as a currency, but it hasn't worked out so well as a currency because it's so volatile. So another innovation that's been created is people have created these stable coins so that are designed, they're cryptocurrencies, but they're designed to keep a stable price. So you don't have this crazy volatility. So project number 3 that's up there, Tether, is tied to the US dollar. So one Tether should be worth always about $1. So people are tending to use those much more for a means of exchange, but it's still a kind of cryptocurrency. And so all of these different companies, for a whole variety of reasons, but a lot of work from visionaries in Zug have created Zug as one of the hotspots in the world for cryptocurrency innovation and development.
Where do they do the mining? Or mine outside?
So I don't know anybody in Zug who's doing Bitcoin mining, but the 3rd generation projects, the process is called staking and not mining, and it uses far less energy. There are tons of people in Zug who are doing staking for various projects. And I actually thought about running a Cardano stake pool myself. I could have done it, but for a variety of reasons, I didn't. But I might come back to it someday, or I might run a Polkadot stake pool. It's not hard to do. Yeah.
Do you work for one of those companies?
Oh, great question. The question was, do I work for one of those companies? No. The answer is that since I have moved to Zug, I've been unemployed and desperately seeking to be employed in some sort of cryptocurrency capacity. So if you know anyone who's hiring, feel free to give them my name.
Well, you have 919 phones.
Yes, I know, you would think, with 919 firms. Somebody's gotta be out there with a job for me.
Started the dock here.
No, he didn't start it. I can't give him credit for that. But he works for the foundation that supports the Polkadot project. Yes.
If I didn't completely misunderstand everything, and that is possible, at the moment I feel that if I was Satoshi, I would feel that my project or experiment has gone wrong.
If you were what?
If I was his founder,
If you were what?
the founder.
Oh, Satoshi. Yeah. Yeah.
At the moment I feel like what I wanted has completely failed and gone wrong. So could I pull this now? Or is that no longer possible?
It's no longer possible. There's nobody. It's just like the internet. How could you pull the plug on the internet? No, it has a life of its own. But you're right. I think Satoshi would be horrified at a lot of things that have happened
At the
with
moment I feel like I would like to die. If I were him,
Yeah.
but there's nothing you can do, right?
No, nothing. Nothing. Nothing.
I'm impression it's a robot or some combination of that.
I think must have been a real person, or some people think it had to have been a group of people.
Yeah, it must be a robot.
Do you know what that Indian golf swimmer that came up with he's not behind it?
The what?
There's this Indian golf swimmer who came up with the idea how poor people can do trade and commerce. He's
Not as far as anybody knows, no. Actually, there's some speculation that whoever it was may well have since died, and that would explain why they haven't been any temptation to leak the story or claim the $9 billion reward. I am very hopeful. I guess I did a really good job of pointing out the issues with Bitcoin. I am very optimistic about the 3rd generation. The proof of stake projects can solve a lot of the issues that have come up with Bitcoin. Bitcoin was an amazing revolution and an experiment in how you could transfer value from one person to the other with no centralized intermediary in instant real time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it couldn't be shut down by anybody, and anybody who wanted to with computers with a little bit of technology skills could interface with the network. And you could, if you wanted it, have pseudonymity. And yes, there are a lot of problems, but I think that revolution will evolve into something that changes the landscape of business in much the same way the internet has, if not even more dramatically. What that will end up looking like, I think it's too soon to say, and who the winners and losers will be, again, I think it's too soon to say. It's completely in its infancy. But I think this technology will have a fundamental revolutionary impact on the way human beings deal with money, which is why I think it's so important for everybody to at least have some appreciation of what's behind it.
But in Africa, they're using some of those cryptocurrencies or virtual currencies. In Africa?
I mean, people are using virtual currencies all over the world. One of the question was, are people using virtual currencies in Africa? And one of the best uses of Bitcoin, where it's an actual use, not just a speculation, is somebody has a business helping immigrants in the US repatriate their funds back to, I don't remember the name of the African country, but using Bitcoin. So it's right now for migrants to repatriate funds back to their home countries. It's a really difficult process, particularly if the people on both sides of the transaction don't have access to normal bank accounts, because then you're paying huge fees to people like Western Union and other money exchangers to transfer currency, and you have to wait a long time. But if you can get that person to buy Bitcoin, they can transfer the Bitcoin. Yes, there's volatility, but then if they transfer it right back into their home currency, it can be a more efficient way of making the transaction. And so there's a whole business that's grown up around repatriation of migrant wages.
They don't need to have a bank account.
No, you don't need to have a bank account. You'd have to have some means of changing the Bitcoin into your local currency on the other side. Yes.
So if you're in a country which has, which is communities, or you're only allowed to take a certain amount out of the country.
Yeah.
You could buy in that country, you buy Bitcoin,
Yes.
you can store it across and you can take it down on the other side, but what if the government ever asks, what did you do with the money here? I mean, it still disappears off your bank account there because you buy Bitcoin.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right. So the question was, if you live in a country that has currency controls and you tried to use Bitcoin to get your money out of the country, yes, you could do it. And people do. That's another use case for cryptocurrency. But you would still have to explain where the currency went, because your account will show the deficit. But they can't stop you from taking it out. And actually, there are companies that make Bitcoin ATMs and cryptocurrency ATMs. So you can go to an ATM. Actually, yeah, there's one in Zug, if anybody's interested. Cryptocurrency ATMs? You can. Yeah, because it's a tax dodge. So you can take your Bitcoin out of an ATM, and then you're not ever giving your information. And because as Americans, we have to report any cryptocurrency gains as part of our taxes. Zug residents do not, but Americans
So is
are
it
taxed.
tax-free then, just like buying and selling stocks with the profit here, in tax, or Bitcoin? It's not ruled yet, right?
I do not want to wade into trying to give tax advice.
It's like it's tricky. I mean, it's not really ruled.
Yes, that is right. There's the tax regulation is still catching up with the realities of cryptocurrency. What I can tell you from personal experience is that Americans are taxed by the US government, regardless of where we live in the world. We're taxed on the basis of citizenship, not residency. And cryptocurrency gains are taxed as capital gains. So anytime I exchange cryptocurrency, I need to report, and I do report that to the US government and pay taxes on the gain or loss.
You said something about the third generation staking. What do you mean by that? Staking.
So staking is an alternative to mining.
Okay.
So mining is the process of using a lot of electricity to solve a tricky computer problem. Staking is a different way of getting the authority to produce a block that has a record of the transactions. But instead of using electricity to solve a computer problem, you convince other people in the network to deposit their stake with you. And the more stake you have, the better your chances are of being the one chosen to produce the block. So it's, if Bitcoin and Ethereum right now are considered proof of work, where you use electricity to do work to demonstrate your authority to make blocks, in proof of stake, you need people to deposit their cryptocurrency, their dots or their ADA and Cardano with you. And then you have a better chance of being chosen to make the block and get the reward. And then those rewards are shared with all of the people who deposited with you, who staked with you.
Is that the venture capital, isn't it?
Is that what?
Venture capital.
Yeah, there's a lot of venture capital. Polkadot just did a public or a sale, and there's a lot of money in cryptocurrency, I think is the bottom line. So I think I've exhausted everyone. Thank you very much for thank you. I really enjoyed this. This is my favorite thing to do, to talk about cryptocurrency, as anyone who's spent any amount of time with me will say. But truly, if you have more questions, if you encounter something, if you're thinking about something, connect with me on Twitter, connect with me on LinkedIn, and please send me questions. I love talking about this. And if you hear of anybody looking for a former banker to work in a cryptocurrency role, I am available. Thank you.